rate of human decomposition. So the way a body decomposes after death.
Christiana, can I ask what led you to be interested in this topic?
Okay, I'm a medical lab science major. I want to be a forensic pathologist.
Oh, okay.
So I have an interest in that.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. So you could look at what happened to the person, how did they die?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the cause of death, manner of death, if the body was moved after death, you could tell that by lividity and such. So this was just a topic I already have a lot of information on in my head, so it was something that I thought would be cool to present.
Okay.
So the first step of decomposition is autolysis, and this begins almost immediately after the body dies. These are two separate slides. This one is from a rat, and this one is from a human, and these are samples of liver cells. And these are showing the steps as they degrade from autolysis, from top to bottom. The experiment that was with this article was using liver tissue samples as an estimation of the postmortem interval, or like the time since death. So that's what these were showing, and that's what that experiment was.
So is this autolysis? Is this the body killing it? Like the cells release?
Yes, it's the lysing of the cells in the body, releasing the cytoplasmic fluids out.
So that's interesting. Yeah, it's not from something in the external environment.
Oh yeah, no, it's a lot of from the blood settling and the enzymes building up and weakening the membranes of the cells, and that's why they start to burst. So this is the first step, and following this will be rigor mortis. Rigor mortis is one of the more well-known steps of decomposition. It begins about 4 hours after death, following the primary flaccidity stage of the body, where it's just kind of like soft and floppy. It begins in the eyelids and the neck and goes down from the body from there, and it occurs because of the loss of ATP. When you no longer have ATP in the bloodstream moving through the muscles, the myosin heads can't retract. So the muscles just stay contracted the entirety of the time, and that's what occurs with rigor mortis. And then following rigor mortis, we're going to have putrefaction. I should have probably warned you guys about the pictures. So putrefaction is the second step. It's caused by the bacteria in the body feeding on the cytoplasmic fluids that were released in autolysis. It's marked by venous marbling, lividity, skin slippage, green discoloration, and bloat. These right here, you can see the veins. Those would be the venous marbling. This one is much more advanced than the one up top. You can see behind that skin slippage, you have bloat shown up here in the upper corner with bloating of both the abdomen and the scrotal sac. And then down here is much more advanced putrefaction. Here we have blistering and advanced skin slippage and green discoloration. So the end of this stage is marked by the release of the gases that build up in bloat. Those gases are actually caused by bacteria inside the body fermenting and releasing gas. That'll typically be released through orifices, or if there was like foul play, there could be like a stab wound or something of that sort. And that could release the fluids from the body. This is saponification. This is what follows the step of putrefaction. Saponification doesn't always happen. It takes a while for it to happen. It's the process in which the fatty tissues within the body turn into soap. They turn to adipocere. It's a soapy substance. This one right here, this is from a case of a man who was, I don't know why that picture is so blurry, underwater for 7 years. So after 7 years, his car was found flipped over underwater. You can see the lividity marks up at the top showing where his seatbelt was still strapped to him. But the interesting thing about this body is when it was found, the the skin and everything had turned to something similar to gypsum. So it was very hard. It was like stone. They had to cut through it with a saw to get to the muscle. And the entirety of his viscera, all his muscle, his fat, his organs, everything, had turned completely to adipocere. And this takes a really, really long time, and it's typically best in an alkaline environment and a moist environment. So it's interesting that this adipocere developed so much because he was in water that was typically more or less neutral and not so alkaline. Here is another image of adipocere. This was more to show the brittleness of it as it progresses, because in initial stages of adipocere, it's going to be more of like a cream-like substance. It's softer. And here, as the fatty acids begin to crystallize, it becomes more hardened and cracks. And that's it. Okay. In more humid areas, we have skeletonization, and this is from all the tissue leaving the body. We have it, I don't know again why it's blurry, but we have a partially skeletonized body here. The tissue's away from it, just where the bone is showing, that would be the part that is skeletonized. And then here is mummification, and this happens in more arid environments. It can also happen in colder environments. A big factor in whether a body will mummify or not, along with humidity, is also insect activity. The maggots and such that begin to break down a body after death break down a lot of the soft tissue that's found on the outside. So when you don't have insects eating those tissues, the tissues will just dry up. And a lot of the times in arid environments, it's because it's so dry, the tissues dry too quickly for the insects to even be able to eat them if they are present. So here we're talking about animal scavenging. This was probably one of the most interesting parts for me to research. Here on this side is scavenging shown by raccoons. So the way that raccoons scavenge body is really interesting. They don't actually eat through the tissue like a dog would. This was a owner who died in the house, and his dog ate his his skull and upper body. It was interesting though, because they couldn't properly determine whether this was a natural cause of death from the owner, because he had eaten his brain and his lungs and his heart and the typical things that would have shown natural cause of death. But raccoons, on the other hand, they won't eat through the tissue. You see a small puncture wound here. The raccoons actually will bite through the dermis, bite a small hole through the dermis, and then reach with their little hands in and pull the muscle out and eat it. So they don't actually eat through the flesh. And that results in the more how would you say, like deflated look of the skin over the bone from the lack of muscle beneath. I have more pictures of that, but I'm going to talk more about the raccoons. So raccoons actually showed a disposition for bodies around like 2-day mark of decomposition. Like that's when they showed the most feeding. So they didn't really prefer fresh bodies too much. And then they would stop feeding on bodies much more quickly, like 3 times as quickly during the summer than they would during the winter. And that was just because the rate of putrefaction was so much faster during the summer due to the heat that the bodies would just become unappealing to them after a while. And then this one is, like I said, the guy who was eaten by his dog. So animal scavenging can still happen indoors. This man here was eaten by his cat. Cats tend to focus on the soft tissues of the hands and the upper head and face. And we also, like I said, insect activity is a big deal when it comes to bodies. Here we have casings, maggot casings, which are actually shown by the, when maggots grow, they kind of shed, and they enter what are called different instars, or stages of life. And so the casings show that this body's been here a while, and it's been here enough for the insects to be growing. It's not fresh laid, whereas here, this body showed no marked decomposition at all, but some blood had built up in his mustache, and it was just enough for the maggots. The flies decided it was good enough to lay their eggs in, and that's how that happened. Anyway, these are all external factors. Oh, that was my question. We're going to go back. So these are all external factors affecting decomposition, but there are internal factors as well. One of the things that I looked up was the process of decomposition in those having insulin-dependent diabetes. When they had, one young girl had insulin-dependent diabetes, and she was found dead the morning after she had passed away, and she had visible green discoloration in her abdomen. This is odd because putrefaction isn't typically visible to the eye until at least 48 hours after death, and she had just been seen alive that afternoon, even though she was ill. Now, this could be caused by a fever. She was, like I said, she was ill, so if she had a fever when she died, that would have raised the internal temperature and caused the bacteria to proliferate more quickly. But also, because she had insulin-dependent diabetes, her sugar level was much higher, which gave a like feast basically to the bacteria, and that's why she decomposed much more quickly than would be typically viewed. There was also an elderly woman who had a similar problem where she had diabetes that was insulin dependent, and she passed away, and her blood levels showed abnormally high alcohol levels. Now, that would be normal in someone who died of like alcohol poisoning or something of that sort, but this woman didn't. However, if you look at it, she had insulin-dependent diabetes, and the fermentation that happened within her body from the bacteria feeding on the sugars, that's what caused her her heart blood to have a higher level of alcohol in it, because glucose is the primary food source for alcohol fermentation and bacteria. There was another man who died in his hot tub. A man in his 50s died of a methamphetamine overdose in his hot tub. And upon death, he released his bowels into that lovely, hot, bubbling water where he stayed for quite some time until he was found. And the heat and the moisture and the bacteria that had just engulfed his body caused extremely marked decomposition, and there was immense skin slippage when he was found. It was just an excellent example of how heat and humidity and water can affect the body's decomposition. Yeah, it's really interesting. All right, I think that is everything. And then, here's a picture of my cat. I thought it might be something better to stare at than maggots. So, any questions? Yes.
What are you doing after undergrad?
What am I doing after undergrad? Okay, well, I was hoping to go on and get my PhD, become a pathologist, and then specialize in forensics. However, that takes 15 years, so that's going to be a lot of work. We're going to see how that goes. If I can't, because there's only about 15 forensic pathologists in the whole United States. There's not very many. Texas doesn't even have a forensic pathology department. So it's a difficult thing to do. But if I don't do that, I'd probably end up, I really like entomology. I'm not going to lie. I love entomology. Forensic entomology. I love the maggots, the instars, all that cool stuff. So I might work with that. We'll see. Yes?
How does embalming someone affect you? Like, where does it pick back up?
All right. Well, embalming is interesting because when you embalm someone, you push out all the blood and the fluids out, and you replace it with a preservative. So you're not going to have the same like autolysis that you would normally have. So like the cells aren't really going to burst as much because there's no enzymes in the blood and such building up and pushing against those cell walls to break them down. But other than that, you'll still see like the drying out of the flesh and such. But also you have to realize when you're embalming someone, you're typically going to put them in a casket, right? And the casket's going to conceal them from scavenging. It's going to conceal them from a lot of the external factors of decomposition. So you're more likely to get like a skeletonization or a mummification from smaller insects that are able to burrow down and get into it. Like ants. Ants have a very interesting way of eating people. It made me itchy, so I didn't put it up there because it was lots of little holes. I can do it. But yeah, those will be the main decomposers. Is the small things that can still get down there, and it won't have the same like bloat that you normally see. It's a much more dry form of decomposition. Yes. My cat's name is Junie B. Bug, but I call her June Bug, and she's great. I found her under